I'm Jamie S. Rich, and this is Back to the Gutters.
I like to use these Pentel pocket brushes.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book. I use a Winsor Newton Series 7. I love comics, so I would
We're here with Randy Bowen today talking about the overlap between sculpture and two-dimensional comic book art and pop culture and everything in between. So thanks for having us, Randy. Thank you for having us in your awesome space.
Thanks for the interest.
So the history of sculpture, from what I can tell, is intertwined pretty extensively with popular figures from stories across history. It seems like you are...
This is modern mythology.
Exactly, like firmly entrenched in the traditions of storytelling in a way that matters to people almost to a quasi-religious extent.
This became abundantly clear to me a couple years ago. I was at the Portland Art Museum and there was a display of Greek and Roman sculpture.
Yeah.
And literally there were figures exactly the same size that I've worked in, of Hercules and other mythological characters, and I just feel like, wow, I'm part of this same thread that's throughout history, and it's a lot of the same character arcs and things like that are the same as they've always been.
So you started off doing a lot of drawing. Was there a distinct shift between working in two-dimensional materials to then working in 3D stuff?
When I was about 6 years old, when my mom would go to work, my grandmother would babysit, and we'd go over to her house, and she didn't really have any toys, but she did have a large box of plasticine clay.
Oh, cool.
And so I would just sit there and make dinosaurs and little monsters and things like that at a very early age. And my older sisters had been teaching me how to write my name even years before that, so I already had a little bit of hand-eye coordination going, and so I was drawing and sculpting at the same time when I was a little kid. Yeah.
Was there a pretty gradual transition from you being a guy who was doing this kind of stuff because you enjoyed it to doing it commercially full-time, or?
Yeah, when I first started off, I wasn't concerned with any of that. I just wanted to make something that looked like what I wanted it to look like.
Yeah.
But then one of the first things I did before the whole statue industry was even in existence, I was making model kits.
Okay.
Where they were cast in resin, and I was making my own molds. So I would design things that I could easily mold, but to do that, I would have to break them down into individual components, like cutting arms off so that a complicated hand wouldn't lock into the figure and make it impossible to mold. So I had to, as soon as I started making molds, I started to figure out how to break a sculpture into individual pieces to make it easier to mold.
Yeah.
And the natural progression from that was, okay, now how do I make this design it so that a guy that lives 1,000 miles away is going to be able to follow my instruction sheet and put it together himself.
So at one point you had started the process of creating a almost human-sized Galactus sculpt, about 5 feet tall.
Yeah, I think it was a little over 5 feet.
Wow.
But it was done so that it would be in scale with the regular statues that we do.
Okay.
So we had done a set of miniature Fantastic Four that were maybe 5 or 6 inches tall.
Yeah.
And I just thought, how cool would it be to have a Galactus done in scale?
Yeah.
So I actually commissioned the factory to create this large version based on a smaller version I had already done. They scaled it up, they sculpted it out of clay. And one of the things that struck me is that many times if the paint jobs aren't absolutely perfect with things that we do, we will cover the shipping to have them returned to us. So I did the math and figured out that a 5.5 foot tall Galactus statue in a box the size of a refrigerator is probably going to cost about $400 to ship it back to me, and then another $400 to ship it to someone in Schenectady, New York, or something like that.
Yeah.
And even though I know people do this kind of stuff, I just know that the level of detail and quality that our collectors have, I was a little gun shy to want to go down that road. And so the only thing that still exists of that Galactus is the head, which I have in a box in my warehouse.
Are there characters that, because of their personality or their history, you get more excited about sculpting than others?
Yeah, I tend to like the obscure stuff because I've sculpted Spider-Man and Hulk and Wolverine so many times.
Right.
I would love to do some of the Marvel characters from the 1940s, like the Finn.
Okay.
Like that would just be for me. You know, no one else would care. But I did a character called the Blazing Skull, which is, you know, it's just an obscure character, and I like to do fun, obscure things like that from time to time, just because I'm a nerd like most of the collectors that buy this stuff.
How many subsets of rules or formal constraints do you put on the process of composing three-dimensionally?
A sculpture is really a series of drawings from a million different angles, but it's all based on form and gesture and the same thing, and different sculptors are different, but I start with a drawing, whether it's a pre-existing comic book cover or just a general pose that I want to develop, and it'll start with a gestural sketch, and then the wire armature becomes basically the stick figure that implies an energy, and so you have a chance to turn the armature around in your hand and get the flow of the line just as you would a sketch.
So that's a question I have for you, is where you feel like your overlap is with sequential storytelling.
You know, sculpture for the most part isn't sequential, but there are aspects that I wanted to bring into comic book statues that have the flavor of a comic book.
Yeah.
For example, a year or so ago, I did a sculpture of Thor, and I've always just had Thor with his hammer up or striking it down or something like that. But one of the coolest things Thor can do is he spins it around his head.
Yeah.
And I had always wanted to do that, but it wasn't until programs like ZBrush and Maya and things like that, I actually designed a spinning hammer, had it cast in clear, and then just painted every other hammer to give it the effect of a spinning hammer.
That was one of my favorite things when I was looking up your work in preparation for our interview. I saw that and I was like, that is brilliant. That set of choices is great.
Thank you. I appreciate your good taste. But not that it has to do anything with sequential art, but I'll have little Easter eggs with certain sculptures. For example, we did a sculpture of Magneto, and he's gesturing as Magneto does. And what I didn't tell anyone is that I put in a rare earth high impact magnet into the palm of his hand. Awesome. And somebody had dropped some paper clips near their Magneto statue, and all the paper clips stuck to his hand, and all of a sudden people are writing about it on the internet and things like that.
I was asking you before about ZBrush and how contemporary technology is merging with your traditional approach. And is that something that going forward you think you might go all digital at some point, or is there still something about traditional materials that's more expedient or satisfying for you overall in your process?
I never want to move completely away from traditional sculpting, because I do like the tactile quality of physically having something right in front of me.
Yeah.
But by the same token, I can't ignore digital sculpting as a tool, because there are some things that I want to make that are going to involve some 3D printing and things like that. And that's the way all of this stuff is sort of going.
Yeah.
For better, for worse. But by the same token, for me personally, I always like the things that look like humans' hands had touched it.
Yeah. Can you imagine, or is it something that you even are interested in, a future where you transition away from doing licensed properties to doing something that is fully of your own making? Is that something that's compelling to you?
Oh yeah, that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Okay.
I've been going through a lot of stuff in my personal life that I don't need to go into, but but I'm getting older, and I'm kind of want to do something that I had a handle in creating, and not just supporting other licensed properties.
Sure. Is there a sort of ideal scenario for you for the next 10 years?
I don't really have a crystal ball. I'm going to spend the next couple of years just experimenting. I want to experiment. I haven't taken a lot of time in the last 20 years to experiment. I've just gone for a certain size and scale and quality level and things like that I knew would sell. Now I need to experiment and do some things that aren't financially based, just to figure out what is it that turns on my creative juices and gets me excited to wake up in the morning and do something fun.
Well, I'd like to see some of that process in person if possible. Could
Sure.
you show us some of how you would achieve those feats of sculpting?
I think that can be arranged. Let's
Awesome.
go.
Let's do it.
All right, Randy, so we're in your studio now, and you're gonna maybe take us through a step-by-step process of how you would do a bust.
Sure. Well, basically you need something to sculpt onto. One of the things that people do sometimes when they're first starting out sculpting, they'll just grab a ball of clay and start pushing into it, but you really need something to hold on to so you're not going to squish the clay. So I'm going to walk you through a very simple armature that's used. Give myself something to mount a wire into. So I pre-cut this little piece of wire. And then you can wrap additional wire, and which I'm about to do, and that's the beginning. So the next step as we go is to start blocking in the body. And you're literally just building from scratch.
Okay. And this is just regular clay, or is it a specific type that...
It's called PSP, which is, I can't remember what PSP stands for. I think it's, I can't remember.
But it stays malleable for a long time, or...
For years, yeah.
Really?
Plus you can reconstitute it with different oil and things like that. In a way, this is the most fun part of the sculpting because it's fast and it's sort of therapeutic. It's like playing with mud.
So with this kind of stuff, are you consciously laying in anatomical components like collarbones and?
Not at this stage. Right now, I'm just going for the general form, and this head's going to get a lot larger. Yeah. So I have to make sure that I don't lose sight of that fact.
Yeah. And with this kind of thing, you also will make it a little bit larger than the finished figure.
Exactly.
Because it shrinks in the process?
In the molding process, it shrinks about 0.7% with each generation of mold, depending on the mold material. But
so each generation, you will mold a figure more than once in some instances?
Right. What we'll end up doing is most of the production is done overseas, so we don't want to send the original overseas because if it gets lost, then you just lost a month's worth of work in creating the sculpture and molds.
Is there a particular set of equations that help you retain the scale similarity between this bust and, say, another bust in a series?
It's not a real science to it.
Is there eyeballing it a little bit?
Yeah, just a little bit of eyeball. After doing it for years, you just, after a while, are able to just eyeball it and tell what's going to work. It's like almost magical to see something come from a lump of clay and bits of wire and wood and have it become something that has personality.
So at what point do you start thinking about the anatomy or the twist and turn of the neck and the head?
The contrapposto, if you will.
There you go.
Yeah. I like to, before I'll put the twist of the head in, I usually will do a pencil sketch before I start the figure, and then just block it in, make sure I got the proportions right, the scale right to the other, if there's any pre-existing figures. Yeah. And
you go back and compare it with things just to not repeat.
Right. And then after this stage, I refine it, it's almost like there's a parallel in drawing where you're drawing out your basic egg shapes and getting the planes of the face first, because the tendency for people that are just starting out is they want to make a face to look at immediately. But you have to put your gratification on hold.
Yeah, you got to lay a good foundation before you can,
exactly,
to use your metaphor, to build the house.
Exactly.
That's cool. And so you're sort of grabbing for tools based on intuition, or is there a sort of a steady rhythm to building up?
Yeah, it's just there's hundreds of different tools you can use, but I usually end up going back to the same 4 or 5 tools on most of the piece.
You made some of these, right? These tools you use now?
Yeah, this one was made out of a piece of deer antler in a
Cool.
drawer pull, but it's nice for getting into, tight crevices and things of that nature.
It's like a big broad section and then a sharper section for all purpose.
Correct. Like if you need to do the straight lines of a lapel on a suit, then you're going to need something that's a little more knife-like.
Okay. Do you shoot photos of things like cloth or props or things like that?
Yeah, I've had people pose as the Shadow and Batman and things like that in the past to get the drapery and the folds of the way jeans and trousers and things like that. It just helps to have some reference, because there's a whole science to wrinkles in clothing, and each fabric has its own set of logic.
That's cool. So like this method of rounding that you have, that's something you then, once you get to the point where you have all the base material, this helps get the fluid.
Yeah, I'm basically establishing the planes in the figure, and it'll make it easier for me later when I'm laying in anatomy and muscles and things like that. And sometimes I'll put in what's called the center line, because that's going to be what everything else is structured from.
Yeah. And so you can still turn the head if you need to and all that.
Correct.
Stuff.
That's why I left the wire bare, so you can. And usually I wait until I have muscles, because sometimes the muscles will actually turn like the real muscle of a figure, and you'll get this happy accident of like the way the skin would wrinkle or something like that.
So then at that point you're not contriving it, you're letting the material help create some realism.
And at this stage, because I know where the muscle striations would be, I tend to even sculpt in the direction of the muscle groups. Then it automatically starts to give you a little bit of realism.
So this looks like it's pretty close to the next stage where you started adding detail. Is it something that at this point starts to really take shape and the little bits and pieces?
Yeah, it's just a matter of, I'll just do a little more refining of this, and then we're on to the detail stage.
Oh, cool. So now you're at the most precise part of the process in the building up of the form, and you've got your dental tools out.
Right, working large to small tools, and the dental tools being the small. Again, this is just for demonstration purposes, but just to give you the basic idea of how to get expression and things like that established.
Yeah. You bring people in sometimes to look at the sculpting process and give you the feedback as part of it?
Marvel will give me their feedback as well if it's, or whoever the licensee is.
Yeah.
And in the case of the zombie cage fighter I'm working on, my buddy Nate is the license owner, so he tells me what he wants to see, because he's looking at it from a fighter's perspective. So
how often in the process do you take shots to get feedback? Is there a designated point?
There's the initial design aspect of it, and you have to get the approval on the design, and then there's probably 2 other stages before it's final that you'll need to show it to the licensor.
So something like this, is there, like, or you're adding hair later, is there things you have to do to get it to stick, or is it pretty consistent in its adherence?
Yeah,
after the fact.
This particular clay is pretty nice, the way it wants to stick together.
That's
With
great.
Sculpey, it's a little less, it's more rubbery and gummy.
Yeah.
With adding hair, something as simple as
Wow.
doing this, you can start to get some shapes. And it totally changes the drama of a piece when it's, and this would all be finessed in, and
Right.
but you can tell that it changes the composition, the lighting, the framing of the face, everything, just by how the clay is reacting.
It did change the whole flow of the character. It feels like there's motion now in a way that there wasn't before. There was weight, and now this is adding a bit of fluidity.
This still has a lot more refinement to go on the anatomy of the back, and then I have to decide, okay, where is this going to be? It might only be this much of the piece by the time it's done, and maybe adding a few more sculptural details.
Yeah.
This is just me winging a face, but normally I would look at pictures of models or people that I know, or something to
bounce an idea
Yeah,
off
or
of.
if it's a classic version of a character, then I would look to comic book reference or.
So at this point, when you're getting to the point where you're finalizing the details, how much before you then take this to a molding process and then put it out there and you'd be satisfied and reach a stopping point?
Never satisfied.
Never.
No, it would just, I could mold it as is now. I'd have to fill in some of the undercuts, but it's basically almost ready to go. That's the general process, is something that's just starts off as wire, wood, and clay, which is essentially mud.
Wow.
You can make something out of nothing.
Oh man, that was something to see, and I really appreciate you walking us through that. It was cool to see happen before my eyes. It was great.
My pleasure.
Awesome. Thanks, Randy.
You bet.
Appreciate it, man.